Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome to our on-site guests at Caixin Summit 2022 Singapore track. And a very warm, tropical welcome to our audiences in Beijing and online. My name is Han Xu. This is the 13th year we're hosting Caixin Summit, and this year is a little special. For the first time, we're hosting this event at 4 different locations simultaneously: Beijing, Shenzhen, Singapore, and Bangkok. Our session today will be streamed back live to our main Beijing venue. This year, we also introduced a new segment of rowing together with some of our guests this morning. I hope you had fun and are not too tired. Now, without further ado, let's welcome the guests of our first session on the topic of reviving multilateralism. Mr. Zhang Tao, Chief Representative for Asia and the Pacific, Bank for International Settlements, who is also the former Deputy Managing Director of IMF. Mr. Takehiko Nakao, former President of the Asian Development Bank, who will be joining us online. Mr. Bert Hoffman, Director of the East Asian Institute and Professor in Practice, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and US. The moderator for this session is Ms. Li Xin, Managing Editor of Caixin Global. Welcome.
Hello, thank you. And very glad to share the stage with 2 distinguished speakers and old friends of Caixin, and online with Nakao-san as well, a very familiar face to Caixin Summit watchers. Today's topic is multilateralism. We have 3 speakers with enormous experience in multilateral institutions. I will start with them with a little bit of history on what the multilateral institution has done right to jumpstart the economy and the development in developing Asia. If you can bring us to the good old days, and then we'll come back to what has changed in our time. Start probably with, on my right-hand side, Zhang Tao in the venue. You have more than 10 years on the IMF, the Deputy Managing Director from 2016 to 2021. What changes have you seen over the decade?
Great. First of all, great. And first of all, thank you, Caixin, for having me here. And very glad to join the friends and colleagues around the world. And the questions, I think, have the answer by itself if just looking around the world. But here I just want to mention 2 things. What happened in Asia, just look at the poverty reductions and living standards improvement. Another thing is, of course, the integration, the word. Let me address the 2 aspects in a little bit more details, just a little bit more, because I know time is limited. The poverty reductions, I think later on, Nakao-san will have a lot of things to say, because the ADB is the one have the mandate, at least one of the mandate there. I think we don't have to say anything on the numbers, but I know ADB had a report. At least I didn't follow very closely, but there's a report back to I think 2012 by ADB. The report said there are 2/3 of the world poor population living in Asia, but the poverty reduction just happened very rapidly. One of the numbers ADB cited over there by then is during the 2005 to 2008, 150 million population already moved out of the poverty. And most recently, the World Bank, where the Bert also worked for a long time, the World Bank had a report in 2022 basically said just China alone, 800 million people are now moving out of the poverty in last 40 years. So the phenomena is tremendous, and so no need to say more. Asia benefit hugely from what's going on in the world. And here I would want to emphasize one thing, which is my second point, is integrations. So during the last 40 years, Asia not only become more integrated within, within themselves, the regional integrations, but also the Asia become much more integrated with the rest of the world. This is in terms of the trade, investment, and also the human, the movement across border. Of course, one of the things I want to point out or highlight at this point is, look at the supply chains. People are saying global supply chains. Asia obviously is the major chunk of it. And these days in Singapore, I participate quite a few number of the meetings, conferences. A lot of people talking about the supply chains. But I have to say that the supply chains contributed greatly in terms of both the efficiencies and resilience. And of course, I hope down the road they will continue to play the role following the more fundamental economic logic or forces when they're dealing with other challenges, including the political and social challenges. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zhang Tao, for a very comprehensive explanation of that. And then we'll turn to Bert. 27 years at the World Bank, I believe, and most of that probably in Asia and a long time in China, and left Beijing with a friendship award by the Chinese government. So how would you say that what World Bank has changed Asia and changed China in particular?
Well, look, first I think Zhang Tao is absolutely right. I think the international system, as was created after the Second World War, has been tremendously beneficial for the world, but particularly for Asia. And second, what I think is the system has also proven to be quite resilient. I mean, if I'm old enough to know a number of the crises that happened, including the breakdown of the Bretton Woods currency system in the early 70s, the Asia financial crisis, the breakdown of the Soviet Union, and the absorption of those countries of the former Eastern Bloc into the global system. That is remarkable, and it has been enormously beneficial. And Zhang Tao already mentioned some of the numbers. For the World Bank, which is part of that system, and yes, it has been my employer for 27 years, so I'm obviously biased. But that system also created the stability and the, if you want, the consensus that development was part and parcel of the deal. So it was not just a free-for-all in a market system, but it was also, if you want, a multilaterally driven system of development banks, ADB, World Bank, others, that helped countries develop. Of course, in China, the World Bank did play, especially at the beginning, quite a special role. They were a window to the world and brought in the knowledge on market systems that at that point was lacking in China. Of course, that role, I mean, that's history. But nevertheless, I think that knowledge role of multilateral institutions is as important. Still, the IMF, the World Bank, others, they bring knowledge to countries that might sometimes be overwhelmed with the problems that they face in managing the economic system domestically and internationally. So there's a lot of good to be said about the multilateral system.
Thank you, Bert. And the knowledge role is something I think we all appreciate, and I think it's evident in China's development as well. And let's turn online to Nakao-san online. You were the 9th president of ADB and stayed there for 7 years, and congratulations to your new book on your time at ADB. It's a very interesting read. How would you describe the change that has taken place, and what was ADB's role?
Yes, we published, ADB published the book of Asia's Journey to Prosperity. It was the very comprehensive account with the 15 chapters from 1960s to 2018. It was published 2 years ago, and it discussed how Asia could achieve growth and poverty reductions in these 50 years. It was based on, by the way, the subtitle is Policy, Market, and Technologies, because these three elements contributed a lot to the achievements of growth and poverty reduction and so on. So it is not quite right, or actually the mistake to regard Asia's growth just based on the government policies or the market without the technology. It's wrong. Asia has educated people well and has achieved health kind of the improvement, and also it has included so many parts of technologies, and we are now, Asia is now developing its own technology. And if you look at the technology level of Singapore, Korea, China, and others, it is now changing the world. So it is what I really want to emphasize in the beginning. And multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the ADB and others also made a real contribution to this achievement. And as by the way, Mr. Jantao and Mr. Hoffman, nice to meet you. And I'm very sorry that I couldn't join in Singapore to renew our the friendship. But what I really want to say is that the World Bank, ADB have, by the way, there is some translations coming. So yeah, so what I want to say is that as Mr. Hoffman mentioned, the ADB and World Bank by the way, translations are coming to my voice, and so maybe there will be some confusion. Can you stop giving a Chinese translation to me, so that we we shouldn't have a mixture of the voices. So the ADB and World Bank and others provided the technologies and also expertise such as how to look at the environmental impact of the projects. Also, these institutions gave some advices together with IMF about the macroeconomic policy management and so on. So these Asian countries, especially China, could take in these ideas very quickly and very widely, and based on the ideas of market-oriented policies and opening up and reforms, private sectors, it achieved a lot. So multilateral institutions were very important elements of the growth, not because of finance. Finance is important, but more important thing was to give the ideas of institutions and the ways project built and so on. But the problem is that we are now having difficulties of keeping this, and we should make every effort to ensure it.
Thank you, Nakao-san. That's exciting to hear all the achievements and all the elements behind all those achievements, but it's never a smooth sailing. And I'm sure you encounter numerous challenges. If you recount your time at ADB, IMF, World Bank, what was the greatest challenge that you faced, and how did you overcome that? Start with Mr. Jantao again. The mic.
Well, thank you. I think this is a very hard question, because if you ask different people, they may come out with different answers in terms of the challenges in their eyes. From my perspective, having worked in various international multilateral financial organizations, I would say that the challenges I would like to characterize in 3 words for these multilateral institutions. That is representations, relevance, and adaptiveness. The first one, representations. It is fair to say that we have seen a gradual but firm change that the Asia's representations at the global stage has improved over the past decades. And of course, that's rightly so, given the size and influence, and particularly the talent pools. So I think this is very much natural to see that happens. And also Asia has a lot to offer in terms of its experiences, its practices. We're just talking about poverty reductions, integrations, and openness. So many of the multilateral institutions have now had their own pivot in Asia, including the institution I am currently working with, the Bank for International Settlement, the BIS. But the process is still evolving and with many gains to be made. So I'm very much optimistic on that. The second is relevance. For these multilateral institutions to remain relevant, that's the hardest part, because today's world is changing and it's changing rapidly. And if you want to maintain to be relevant, you have to stay, on one hand, stay true to your mandates. On the other hand, you have to make your mandate, such as, depending on which institution you are, for example, capital flow management, how to address the climate change, and how to deal with the digital transformations. So all of these are some of them related to the traditional challenges, some of them are so-called emerging challenges. So, but whatever challenges, you have to remain relevant to address the concerns by the stakeholders, by the general public. So how to do it, and it's up to each of us to answer. And last point is we have to be adaptive or evolving with the time. And this is somewhat related to the second point, relevance. So multilateral, including the regional financial institutions, need to be forward-looking and scan the horizons for emerging trends and understand how these may affect their activities. And this is challenging things to do, but it is also necessary. And at the BIS, for example, 2 years ago, in response to the rapid change in terms of the fintech, we set up the innovation hub and centers, and working with our member central banks, and including the private sectors on the issues related to digital innovations, including particularly CBDCs, and try to find a way to understand it more, and in terms of how to improve the fast payment, but including the cross-border fast payment. So I will come back to that later on, but I just stop here. Thank you.
So representation, relevance, adaptation, and all those are very comprehensive. That's a good framework to understand the challenges and also the changes those institutions are taking. Bert, how about you? What is the biggest challenge? And as the journalists always say, give me a story.
Well, my personal story starts with the Asia financial crisis, where I always say I grew up as an economist, and that was a crisis of a sudden stop in capital flows. That at that point we thought it was unique to Asia, but actually, we've learned. First of all, Mexico was before that. Afterwards, the global financial crisis had similar issues surrounding it, and if you want, the system, the international financial system, is I'm not saying prone to crisis, but there is definitely some gaps in managing the crisis or preventing the crisis, and I think that is a very big issue. Zhou Xiaochuan, after the global financial crisis in 2009, he came up with a number of suggestions, but one of them he was really concerned about the dollar dominance of the system, not because he didn't like the dollar, but it was always this liquidity in dollars that completely dried up in times of crisis, and he felt that should be resolved. It's still an issue on the table. The system is still dollar dominant. During the COVID crisis, in March 2020, the system almost broke down. Even the US Treasury market almost broke down because everybody wanted to be liquid and there was no liquidity. So that's just one of these issues in the plumbing that we haven't really fully resolved. The second is representation. I fully agree with that. I mean, having worked on China for a very long time, China should have about 15% of the quota in the IMF and about 15% of the shares of the World Bank. They have 6%. And so the adaptation of this system itself to a changing world, one can question that. And frankly, it's a source of tension. But more broadly, in the thinking about development, the thinking about the international financial system, the voices of countries that have managed their affairs well, including China, probably can be more prominent in the system. And I feel that it is still under rewarded of the achievements of China and others. So that their voices should be better heard. The third, and that's really the topic of the day, is geopolitics. And it remains to be seen, now let me be careful, it remains to be seen whether the system is robust enough to withstand some of the geopolitical tensions. And it's too early to tell, but clearly there are tensions. Clearly some of the rules that were written down are not obeyed because of geopolitical tensions, and I'm talking about, the weaponization of the dollar is one. The WTO and the national security clause in the WTO, which plays a very central role in what the US is currently doing in terms of trade and tech measures. So the system is being tested as we speak, and hopefully it will come out stronger, but that's not a given.
Very good. It's very alarming, but it's really one of the biggest challenges we're facing today. And turning online to Nakao-san, what would be the challenge that you faced?
Thank you very much. I think what Janto spoke about, 3 dimensions were very important kind of reference to think about this. But about relevance and adaptability, I believe that we have changed the international systems gradually, but very solidly. And for instance, ADB started from plain vanilla support for the building projects in countries, but over time, because of the importance of institutions and policies, by using policy-based loans, the ADB supported public-private partnership ways of building a project by involving private sector money, and also shifted focus more from industrial kind of development to gender, education, health, and others. And also these days more about climate changes. So although it looks gradual, I think institutions have been changing. International institutions have been adaptive and also trying to sustain the relevance. And that's what I really tried to do when I was at the ADB. And I, for instance, merged the grant and the concession loan operations accounts to merge it to the, especially concessional loan part would be was merged to the ordinary resources, because countries are already not so poor and they can service repayment. So we don't need the special account for concessional loans, because they can repay, and we can use the leverage by issuing bond to provide loans to these countries, even if it is concessional. So anyway, I would like to challenge that we if it is regarded that these institutions are not adaptive or relevant. And also about representations, I think emerging economies, especially China, has been given very large shares, and also the number 2 positions at the World Bank and IMF and the ADB quite soon. And in case of Japan, when the Japanese GDP was more than 10%, of course, IMF representation was about 6% or even less. And it took so much time for Japan to get some more quotas relative to the GDP. So GDP number or weight in the World Bank or world economy doesn't guarantee automatically the larger shares of the equities or the voices in these institutions, because the former shareholders have some relevance, and also they made a huge contribution to these institutions. I believe China has already given a very large voices in terms of the positions, and also China is regarded kind of rivalry to the United States in terms of economic powers and the military power, geopolitical power, and voices in the world. So the effectiveness of the international institutions is not about how much shares emerging economies should have. Actually, after the Asian financial crisis, as Bart mentioned, there was a very big impact from Asian emerging economies crisis. So the G20 was established in the finance and financial ministers and central bank governors corridors, and it was established, and then it became the leaders meeting after global financial crisis. And also financial stability forum was established to include the financial regulators in addition to central banks and Ministry of Finances. But this is because, and this is to include also emerging markets. So we changed the representation very much compared to the 1950s or 60s. So the effectiveness of international institutions is not about these issues, but I think it is the will or the commitment by the big shareholders like China or the United States and others, and also smaller economies. That is a matter of the commitment and the will of these institutions, because in the end, the world is a gathering of sovereign states, and without the cooperation between sovereign states, even international institutions alone cannot solve the problem. So I think it is very important that the big economies especially should make further cooperations to enhance the function of multilateralism, globalism, and so on. And that is the most important problem. And the geopolitical kind of conflict between China and the United States is really damaging this global kind of order. And it's not because China is not given the bigger voices, but we should try to manage the challenges. We cannot totally solve the different opinions, but we should try to manage the issues, and we should try to keep the importance of the multilateralism and globalism as much as possible.
Bert, would you agree?
Well, managing it is indeed very important. I mean, I do believe that for representation, that is also optics, and having the rightful share. I think we can debate on what that share exactly should be, but clearly there was agreement. There's agreement in the IMF that it should largely be according to GDP. That's undisputed. I mean, in fact, that's derived from the Articles of Agreement. In the World Bank, the agreement was in the Peru annual meetings. It was basically to weigh both share in the world economy and indeed the contribution to development, which became then the contribution to IDA. But according to that formula, China would have 14%, not 17 or 18 as they have the share in the world economy. It's still much higher than today. The second thing is representation is much more the intellectual dialogue. I do think that it is an important fact. I mean, China has been the most effective reducer of poverty in the world. And yes, it has its own system. Politically, it's very different. But you can also say, well, that's actually part of the world. And so trying to learn more of the lessons from that, seeing how that can apply to others, is, I think, an important role of international organizations. And third, some of those will maybe require changing of some of the rules. It's not that those rules are set in stone. It's not that there's only one route to development. And that I feel that debate hasn't been had enough. And that is reflected in the rule book of the WTO, which basically was set in 1948, but then 1996 revised. A lot of the rule books, not in the Articles of Agreement, but of the international financial institutions as they have evolved, have, I think, not yet fully taken into account the lessons that we could learn. And that's also a matter of representation. Thanks.
Thanks. And I want to switch the topic slightly into trade. And also, many of the companies do care a lot about the trade tensions today, including the supply chain disruption that Mr. Zhang Tao has just mentioned, the war, and the great power competition, geopolitics. You once said, Mr. Zhang Tao, that no issue looms larger than trade. How do we resolve that?
Well, thank you. Remind me what I said. I guess this is, I said it in, 2019, in some occasions, where I basically arguing for support to trade in goods and services as a key engine for growth and job creations. I think what I said now are even more relevant when we are trying to recover from the COVID and try to fight with high inflations, at the same time to try to keep the job created for the general public. But the question is, of course, as you said, how to achieve it. And of course, people around the world may have different opinions, but I think from my perspective, trade has to be remain open, remain fair, and remain rule-based. Of course, the multilateral institutions will all play a role, and together with the general public, private sectors, and public around the world. And WTO is one, of course, they should play, including some of the leading roles here. But for others, we also have to contribute on our part. Like BIS, based on our mandate, we work very closely with our member central banks. Our job is make sure our coordinated actions to be better prepared for all kinds of shocks, including those shocks you just mentioned, to try to maintain, the economic price stabilities and financial stabilities. And here I just want to highlight one thing is this is something related to the applications of new technologies in the finance industries or in the areas of finance, including the digital currencies and cross-border payment. So what we are doing is we are working with our central government, and depend on their interest, and also depend on their mandate. We group them together and set up the centers around the world, and undertaking different the pilot project. The idea is try to understand how the new technologies, particularly the technology related to CBDCs and fast payment systems, how these changes, how the impact on the financial system would be, particularly on financial stabilities. And of course, at the end of the day, we hope we would remain, first of all, of course, understand the trend. Second, we would remain relevant for the technologies. We're not, in a sense, we are now try to take the lead of the innovations, but we should be part of the innovations together with the private sectors. And of course, make sure what we are doing, what we are working on in terms of the regulatory measures will not only, will try to stabilize whatever the new forces, at the same time make the benefits of new technologies to the most possible way. So that back to the point that once you have the stable environment particularly with the economic and financial stabilities, then in a way you would enable for trade and investment so that you maintain the growth and job creations. Thank you.
Thank you. A very important point that we usually overlook, that the trade, in discussing trade, the change of technology and what if impact that might have. And when we talk about trade, usually there's a lot of ism. There's pluralism, there's multilateralism, and now it's more regionalization that we're looking at. And you can look at CPTPP, RCEP, you name it. Is regionalization the way forward, Bert?
Well, let me just say, I hope not, because you will lose out on some of the efficiency gains and the productivity gains that you can have with a global system. But frankly, in today's world, it is easier to find regional solutions, and that's a fact. It's the RCEP is one example. CPTPP in North America, well, it's now called the US MCA. Sorry, NAFTA 2. For me, it's still NAFTA 2. So those regional solutions with more like-minded systems, that seems to be easier to do. But the big gains came from the globalization, and Zhang Tao mentioned technology, which is actually, it's not a rule book that made globalization. It is technology, it is the transport technology and communication technology that made globalization possible. The big difference was indeed China, the 2001 entry into the WTO, which enormously increased the number of people engaged in the world economy. Frankly, I do think that had huge consequences for many countries around the world, and China's not to blame, but those effects did cause some of the backlash against trade and did cause some of the backlash against the organization of WTO. I personally believe that is misguided, but nevertheless, that's a political fact. And in part of the consequence, there's been sort of more regional trade agreements, more partial trade agreements among more like-minded countries in reaction to that, because people stopped believing into that big globalization. Nevertheless, the big efficiency gains came from that huge division of labor across the globe, and they're yet to be had, because there's behind China comes India, behind India comes Africa, and they are yet to get the full benefits of that globalization. And it would really be detrimental to those people if globalization were to have a backlash and we would sort of move away from the WTO system. So I remain optimistic. I realize that indeed in a number of regional arrangements can actually prepare also global change. So some of the new ideas are better done, how to handle data. CPTPP under the leadership of Japan has made good progress there. How to handle industrial policy wasn't done in the WTO, frankly. It's not that we forgot about it, but it was Europe and the US that was fighting. So there were very few rules on industrial policy. Comes China, which does a lot of industrial policy, and it becomes an issue. So CPTPP, a regional solution, actually addresses those issues. So maybe they can be stepping stones towards a better global system in the future.
Thanks. So regionalization is the way forward, but it's not the ultimate destination. Eventually, that's globalization. Nakao-san, ADB has obviously a very regional mandate. And how do you see the regional versus global question?
Yeah, first, I would like to mention clearly that I'm not objecting to the idea of this is about the former theme. That is, I'm not objecting to the increasing representation by emerging economies, including China, but the effectiveness of the multilateral institutions is not because of the bad representations, but because of lack of commitment and also the lack of a spirit of cooperation. That's what I want to say. So it's okay gradually that these countries have a more representation, but it's not connected to the effectiveness. But trade, I am a very strong believer that trade and exchanges of of course, goods and services, and more we are now trading services by the business process outsourcing through internet. India and the Philippines are champions of these services. So trade is making people more prosperous, and also we enjoy more things. And tourism is another kind of trade, and we are benefiting a lot from these things. And Asia is benefiting the very big beneficiary of the free trade and free trade of goods and services, and people's exchanges, and also the technologies. And this is challenged not because of the specific issues, but because of hyper globalization, which is making everything freely moved, is in a sense causing some troubles, and factory workers in developed countries are now facing the competition from emerging economies export, and also some peoples even in developing countries, the workers don't gain as much as the rich, because the rich have more access to the higher educations, and also partner with the other countries and so on. So what I want to say is more divide in the societies is kind of a very difficult challenge to both developed countries and developing countries to have a more free trade. And also pandemic, and there can be also another economic security, which is if the supply chains are stopped all of a sudden by earthquake and pandemic and others, they are very anxious. So many countries try to keep a certain production within the countries. So these changes can be some, I can understand that some adjustment to the totally hyper globalization. We need a certain production in each countries, and it makes sense. But at the same time, we are affected by the geopolitical tensions, and it's not a good idea to have a regional bloc because of geopolitical tensions, and especially between the US and China. It is very clear that the US, for instance, is concerned about the use of technologies by China for military purpose, and as Barto mentioned, issues of industrial policies or the subsidy by the state to the private sectors. So it is a competition of technologies, competitions of economic power, and there can be element of the military affairs. So if some technology can be used, or some traded goods can be used for military purpose, it should be controlled. That is the idea of America, and China is now trying to challenge it, and there can be the anti sanctions policies, laws in China. So it is becoming escalating, and I think it's really detrimental to the prosperity and the happiness of the people. So how can we manage it? It's not just a matter of rule of WTO, but it's a more basic issues of rivalry between China and the US. And in a sense, they are provoking each other. I'm sorry to say this, but each country, not just the US and China, but other countries can be included. But we should avoid the provocations, and we should try to be moderate, and we should make serious efforts of looking at issues more from economic perspective instead of the geopolitical perspective. So once again, in short, I think some adjustment to hyper-globalization is unavoidable, but we should avoid more escalations of bloc economies like before the World War II from geopolitical tensions.
Very important. And with that, I want to introduce a new segment into our discussion. That's every single one of you are delegates in the room, because what we just discussed is not just abstract international, multinational systems. It's actually something they are watching very closely, the trade, the disruption of supply chain, as well as the geopolitical tensions and the threat. and you are hedging against that in your everyday business decision. We want to see that. So usually when you host a conference, you don't want people to look at their phones, although they look at that anyways. But today, we're gonna ask you to take out your cell phone and please scan the QR code or log on the website or type in the number, but scan the QR code is better. Please scan the QR code. And then you'll be coming into a page that says interactive session. Oh, Bert, do you have your phone with you on stage? I didn't know that. So, question number 1. How many countries does your company have branches in? Basically, that's your exposure of all the disruptions and the geopolitical threats we just mentioned. 1 to 5, 11 to 20, above 20. So the majority of them are within 1 to 5, and then still increasing. So at least that's a multiple number of countries people are operating in. Next question. Which of the following trends do you think will have the greatest impact on the future growth of your company? You can choose two. You can have 2 options. First one is climate change and green development. Second is global inequality, geopolitical clashes, and economic nationalism and protectionism. Obviously, geopolitical tensions, more than 50%. And that's really put a footnote on what we discussed. And climate change, 17%, that's pretty serious number as well. And economic nationalism, protectionism. I believe that's the concern of a lot of companies going into different countries. Next question, please. And this is a rather open-ended question, so I want you to help type in your answer. What measures does your business take to hedge or reduce the impact of protectionism? It can be one word, it can be a sentence. And well, most important of all, it's anonymous. So please type in your question into this answer that will pop up. What measures does your business take? Recruit diverse teams. Diversify. Fairly good. Globalization. Any other choices? Spreading the risk. I wonder how. And go global. Go global with courage and determination. That's pretty good. I mean, especially many of the participants are China-based companies. So now, given the geopolitical tension, I think many of them are going global and diversify. That's a very interesting answer as well. 开源节流, basically reducing the cost and improving the efficiencies. So very good. I want to encourage some of you to explain that in more details later. Focus on our strength and avoid standing under the falling tree. That's very important as well. So next question, the last one, relevant to our discussion today. In your opinion, does reconstructing multilateralism meaning creating a new order, or does it mean reforming the old one? You can choose A or B. Reform the existing multilateral institutions. 100%. So I think that's the spirit we have for the session. So with that, I want to have a quick comments from our panelists, and also I want to invite some of our delegates today to explain more details that how you see the challenges and what are the actions you are taking. So anyone, Bert, please?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm very happy I'm not a businessman, that I don't need to make all those very difficult decisions. I think we're living at a time of extraordinary uncertainty because of this geopolitical tension that is there, but we don't quite know where that's going to end. And there is no real rule book for it. So to actually make decisions in that environment is very difficult. What I hear also from other businessmen and women, business people, that I speak to is that they're gravitating towards a sort of a fact that it's going to be difficult to do business with China from outside China. It could be because of geopolitical issues, technological barriers that the US puts up, or because of China's strategy of dual circulation, which is onshoring the critical supply chain. So it's the China for China, and then it is the the global market is going to be served maybe with some inputs from China, but with final assembly somewhere outside China. And that I think we see some of that already happening. Vietnam is a beneficiary. Indonesia seems to be a beneficiary. But it's only starting. It's only starting. And I think that is actually going to be a bigger wave. So a major reorganization of global supply chains as a consequence of geopolitics.
Interesting. And Jean-Tao, please.
Great. We are not the business firms, but we do have two regional offices in addition to the headquarters at the Basel, Switzerland. We have two branches offices. One is in Hong Kong, and the other one is in Mexico City, in Mexico. That coincidence with just the quiz questions, the first one, where I saw everyone want to go global, some part of the places other than your headquarters. The BIS also want to go global. The reason is because we are a collection of a central bank around the world. And right now, more and more, the global financial stabilities are everybody's business. And it is not just one or two banks, whether or not this is in Asia or in America or in Europe, can undertake or shoulder the burdens. Everybody have to work together jointly. That's why the global is very, very important. The second, my takeaway from the surveys here is people enormously overwhelmed by short-term concerns. If you see the geopolitical tensions outweigh the climate change, just here. That result, of course, represents the small sample here. If you ask different group of people, the answer might be different. But really, we are facing the short-term and long-term challenges. To me, both the geopolitical tensions and the energy transitions and digital transitions, these are longer-term challenges we are all facing. So maybe because we are working with our member central banks, many of them, of course, work on for short-term issues, including, for example, inflations. And many of them also look at the long-term issues, including this energy and digital transitions, are very much top at their agendas. So my general sense is, even the surveys, the little samples, is very much coincidence with, the policymakers, at least as far as I know, those colleagues I work with. So I think it's pretty much consistent. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a whole segment on energy transition and sustainability right after this panel. And before we turn to Nako-san, anyone wants to raise your hand to explain that the threats you say or have any comments? If now, Nako-san, you have the final word.
Thank you very much. Once again, we must realize that we need each other very much in today's world, trade and service and everything and technology. So we don't need to repeat the mistake of history. For instance, Japan made serious mistakes before the war in 1930s from departing from internationalism and by trying to expand the territory, the territorial influence, and it was disastrous because for Japan, the biggest trade partners were China and the United States. So why did Japan need to expand the territories? Because they benefited from trade already. So we don't need to make a mistake of returning to the bloc economies or the imperialism. And so, and also, I believe that the post-war multilateral institutions, multilateralism, globalism, and so on, have been very beneficial to most of the countries. And so, as the questionnaire answer to the questionnaire referred, we need to reform existing system if it is necessary, and we are doing it. And we don't need to totally change the system, and we should respect the existing order, like many issues in geopolitical arena. So we don't need to try to change things from the bottom up, and then we can try to modify things, and we should try to ensure the existing orders are restructured, but also respect that today's order is more or less stable, and we must enjoy the benefit of these things by modifying and reforming, but still respecting it. So this is my final comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Nakao-san. With that, in a short period of time, we talk about the history and achievements of multilateralism. We talk about the challenges that many and solutions that many too, including tech, including regionalization as the stepping stone. But eventually, I think it's the collaborative spirit will carry that over there. And remember the last chart on the survey, 100% supportive of reforming the existing system instead of completely overhauling that. I think that's the spirit we're looking for. With that, please join me in thanking our guests today for sharing their wisdom and insights, and for thanking every one of you for sharing your insights as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nakao-san. Hope to see you in Singapore next time.
Good to see you, Naga-san.
Okay.
Very
Yeah,
nice
nice to see you.
Yes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion.